The year is 1453. The greatest city on earth, Constantinople, the 1,000-year bulwark of Christendom, has fallen. Its walls are dust. Its churches are mosques. The last echo of the Roman Empire is silent. A 21-year-old Sultan, Mehmed II, stands astride the ruins, earning his name, Fatih, the Conqueror. He has done what no ruler, Muslim or Christian, had dared to dream. He has shattered the unshakable, and in the capitals of Europe, from Rome to Buda, from Venice to Paris, there is only one paralyzing question: who is next? The Sultan's gaze turns west, to the fertile plains of Hungary, the gateway to the heart of Europe. But to open that gate, he needs a key, a fortress city, planted like a jagged tooth at the confluence of two mighty rivers, the Danube and the Sava, a city the Hungarians call Nándorfehérvár. We call it Belgrade. In the summer of 1456, the largest army the world had ever seen would smash against its walls. What happened there, over 19 haunting days of resistance, was not just a siege. It was a collision of worlds, a desperate, bloody, and ultimately miraculous struggle that would decide the fate of a continent. This is the story of the old warrior, the fanatic friar, and the peasant army who stood against impossible odds and saved Europe. To understand the terror of 1456, we must first understand the man who inspired it. Sultan Mehmed II was not a barbarian. He was a Renaissance prince, a polyglot who spoke 6 languages, a student of classical history, a patron of the arts. He studied Caesar and Alexander. And like Alexander, he believed his destiny was to rule the world. But he was also a man of cold, terrifying ambition, a military genius who fused ancient strategy with the most terrifying new technology on earth, gunpowder. His army was the image of its master, disciplined, modern, and utterly ruthless. At its core were the Janissaries. They were not born Turks. They were the devshirim, the blood tax. Christian boys, taken from their families in the Balkans, raised as slaves of the Sultan, converted to Islam, and forged into the most elite and fanatical infantry on the planet. They were forbidden to marry. Their only family was their core. Their only father was the Sultan. Their only purpose was war. An Ottoman chronicler, Tursun Beg, wrote of them, "They are a wall of iron. They do not know retreat. To them, the place where their comrade falls is the place where they must stand, until they too fall or the enemy is broken." Flanking this iron core were the Sipahis, heavy armored cavalry who served in exchange for land, and the Akinjis, the terrifying, unpaid light cavalry who rode ahead, their only salary the plunder they could take. And then came the Azabs, the irregular infantry, often little more than a wave of bodies meant to soak up arrows and exhaust the enemy before the Janissaries delivered the killing blow. But the true heart of Mehmed's new model army was not flesh, it was bronze. 3 years earlier, at Constantinople, a Hungarian engineer named Orban had built Mehmed a monster, a super cannon, the Basilic, 27 feet long, capable of hurling a 1,200-pound stone ball over a mile. It took 60 oxen to move, and hundreds of men to service. It, and dozens of other massive bombards, had pulverized walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Now, in the spring of 1456, Mehmed gathered this unstoppable force once more. He did not come to Constantinople's conqueror with just one monster. He came with an entire orchestra of them. Over 300 cannons, of all sizes, were dragged north from his capital at Edirne. His target was Belgrade. The fortress was not just a military target, it was a personal insult. In 1440, his own father, Murad II, had tried to take the city and had failed, repulsed by its walls and its defenders. It was the one great blemish on the Ottoman record of conquest. Mehmed, the conqueror of the true Rome, would not make the same mistake. He gathered an army estimated at over 80,000 strong, though some sources claim well over 100,000. A river of steel, bronze, and humanity, flowing north through the lands of his reluctant vassal, the Serbian despot, Durad Brankovic. The old Serbian ruler, whose capital Belgrade had once been, was forced to stand aside and watch the Ottoman horde march toward the city he had been forced to cede to Hungary. As the Sultan's army snaked toward the Danube, all of Christendom trembled. Pope Calixtus III, an old frail Spaniard, was gripped by terror. He issued a papal bull, ordering prayers for the deliverance of Christendom. He commanded that every church in Europe ring its bells every day at the hour of noon, a call for all faithful to stop and pray for the defenders of Belgrade. This was the origin of the noon bell, a tradition that continues in many churches to this day. But it was not born of celebration. It was born of pure, unadulterated fear. The Pope wrote, "The Turk, the most cruel enemy of the cross, inflated by the conquest of Constantinople, now prepares to thrust his venomous sword into the very heart of Europe. We must halt this flood, or we shall all be drowned." But who? Who could possibly halt this flood? The great kings of Europe were busy with their own squabbles. France and England were licking their wounds from the 100 Years' War. The German princes were feuding. The king of Hungary himself, the 15-year-old Ladislaus the Posthumous, was a king in name only, his realm controlled by rival, bickering nobles. The nobles saw the threat, but they were slow to act. They debated, they postured, they demanded money and titles, they promised to raise their banners, but the weeks dragged on and no army appeared. The defense of all of Christendom, the fate of the West, would not fall to a king, or a united alliance, or a grand army. It would fall to three men: a disgraced old general, a fortress commander with a skeleton crew, and a 70-year-old, barefooted friar with an army of peasants. The first of these men was Mihály Szilágyi. He was the brother-in-law of our second hero, and he was the man on the ground. As ban, or governor, of the fortress, he was in command of Belgrade's defenses. He was a professional soldier, grim and dutiful, and he was watching a garrison of perhaps 7,000 men. 7,000 men to hold a city with a perimeter of miles against an army of 80,000. He prepared. He reinforced the walls, though he knew they were built for catapults, not cannons. He stockpiled arrows, oil, and grain. He looked to the south and saw the dust cloud of Mehmed's approach. He looked to the north, across the Danube into Hungary, and saw nothing, no relief army, no royal banners. He was, for all intents and purposes, alone. But he was not entirely alone, because his brother-in-law was John Hunyadi. If Mehmed was the new Alexander, John Hunyadi was the old lion, the Turk beater. He was 69 years old, a lifetime in the 15th century. He was the regent governor of Hungary, the most powerful man in the kingdom, and the most feared. He had spent his entire life fighting the Ottomans, from the fields of Varna to the bloody plains of Kosovo. He knew them. He knew their tactics, their strengths, and their weaknesses. He was the one man in Europe whom the Janissaries truly respected and perhaps even feared. But the old lion was tired. He was politically isolated. The young king and his court of nobles, jealous of Hunyadi's power, had stripped him of many of his titles and estates. When he pleaded with them to raise a national army to relieve Belgrade, they stalled. They made excuses. They demanded Hunyadi fund the war himself. Using the last of his personal fortune, Hunyadi began to raise a small, professional relief force of mercenaries and loyal household knights. But he knew it wasn't enough. He had perhaps 10,000 men. It was a bodyguard, not an army. How could he fight 80,000? As Hunyadi struggled to find soldiers, another man was finding souls. His name was John of Capistrano, Giovanni da Capistrano, a 70-year-old Italian Franciscan friar. He was a thin, frail, ascetic man who owned nothing but his robes and walked barefoot across the continent. But when he spoke, he was not frail. He was a fire. He was an inquisitor, a theologian, and a charismatic preacher of terrifying intensity. The Pope had sent him north to preach a crusade against the Turks. And so he did. He walked the dusty roads of the Hungarian plains, from village to village, his wooden crucifix held high. He spoke not to the nobles, but to the common folk, to the peasants, the blacksmiths, the millers, the students. His message was simple. The Turk is the instrument of the devil. To fight him is to fight for Christ. The nobles have abandoned you. The king has abandoned you, but God has not. Take up your scythe, take up your flail, take up your pitchfork. God will give it the strength of a sword. He who dies in this holy war will have all his sins forgiven and dine this night in paradise. A contemporary, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, the future Pope Pius II, wrote of him with a mix of awe and contempt. This man, old, frail, and small of stature, with all his flesh dried up, skin and bone, yet he rants and raves every day, and in his sermons he moves the people to such a degree that they weep and beat their breasts. The people flock to him, not soldiers, a mob, a ragged, disorganized, undisciplined mass of tens of thousands of peasants. They had no armor. Their weapons were farming implements. Their commanders were village priests. They were not an army. They were a pilgrimage of the doomed. And they were all Hunyadi had. The old general, the master of tactics and discipline, was appalled. He saw them as a liability, a rabble that would break and run at the first sound of a Janissary war cry. He reportedly said, "What am I to do with these priests and tillers of the soil? They know how to pray and how to reap, not how to fight." But Capistrano, his eyes blazing, retorted, "The Lord who made the beginning will take care of the end." These were the saviors of Europe, a professional soldier with no army, a fortress commander with no hope, and a fanatic friar with a mob of peasants. By the end of June 1456, Mehmed's vast army arrived at Belgrade. The earth itself seemed to tremble. The Sultan's silken tents, a city in themselves, were pitched on a rise overlooking the fortress. The Janissaries, in their white felt caps, dug their trenches. The Azabs and Sipahis fanned out, sealing the landward side. And on the Danube, a flotilla of over 200 Ottoman galleys and river boats, chained together, blockaded the river. Belgrade was now an island. Szilágyi and his 7,000 men were trapped. The jaws of the trap had closed. Mehmed's 300 cannons opened fire. It was not a medieval siege. It was an industrial demolition. The great bombards, positioned by Mehmed himself, concentrated their fire on the weakest sections of the wall, the thinner landward side of the lower town. The sound was a physical blow, a continuous, deafening thunder that never, ever stopped. It was heard for 100 miles. The ground shook. Buildings inside the city collapsed from the sheer concussion, miles from the walls. For the defenders, it was a psychological torture. A man named John of Tagliacozzo, a Franciscan traveling with Capistrano, wrote, "There was no moment of silence, not by day, not by night. The air was filled with black smoke and the stench of sulfur. The great stone balls, larger than a man's torso, did not just strike the walls, they shattered them. They burst through, sending splinters of stone like knives, killing men who thought they were safe 100 feet behind the rampart." The walls of Belgrade were tall, built of white limestone. But they were old. They were built to repel arrows and catapults. Against Orban's guns, they were chalk. Day after day the bombardment continued. July 5th, July 6th, July 10th. For nearly 2 weeks, the cannons chewed away at the fortress. The outer walls of the lower town, the section bordering the Danube, simply dissolved. They crumbled into a massive, sloping ramp of rubble. Inside, Szilágyi and his men worked frantically. They built new inner defenses of earth and timber, knowing they wouldn't last. They rationed food. They rationed water. They prayed. They watched the Ottoman banners, the horsetail standards, and the crescent moon drawing ever closer. Mehmed was patient. He was a master of this. He would not waste his janissaries. He would wait until the walls were not just breached, but entirely erased. He would wait until his men could simply walk into the city. Meanwhile, just 20 miles to the north, John Hunyadi and his small relief force watched from the opposite bank of the Danube. He was joined by Capistrano and his vast, unwieldy mob of crusaders. They could hear the cannons, they could see the smoke, they were so close and yet they were a world away. Between them and the dying city lay the Danube. And on the Danube was the Ottoman fleet, 200 ships, chained together bow to stern, a 3-mile-long impenetrable barrier of wood and steel. Hunyadi knew the truth. Belgrade could not hold. If he did not break that blockade, if he could not get his men and his food into the city, the siege was already over. He had a fleet of his own, about 200 small, fast Hungarian river boats, known as sheikhs. They were supplemented by boats crewed by Serbs who, despite their despot's neutrality, had come to fight for the city. These sheikhish crews were the best rivermen in the world. They knew the currents, they knew the sandbars, but they were facing a fleet of heavy galleys, armed with their own cannons and elite Janissary marines. To attack them was suicide. On July 13th, the bombardment reached a crescendo. The outer wall was gone. A vast, sloping breach lay open. Mehmed's commanders urged him to order the final assault, but the Sultan, wary of Hunyadi to his north, decided to wait one more day. He would wipe out the relief force first. Hunyadi knew he had no choice. It was now or never. July 14th, 1456. The day dawned, hot and still. On the north bank of the Danube, Hunyadi's 10,000 mercenaries and knights boarded their boats. Alongside them, tens of thousands of Capistrano's peasants, armed with scythes and crosses, piled onto rafts, barges, anything that would float. On the river, the Ottoman fleet waited, a crescent of tall masts and loaded guns. Hunyadi's plan was desperate. He knew he couldn't fight a conventional naval battle. His sheikhs were fast, but they would be blown out of the water before they got close. So he relied on chaos. His flotilla did not advance in a line. It came on as a swarm. The key was the current. His expert boatmen used the river's flow to build up speed, aiming for the center of the Ottoman line, where the flagship of the Ottoman admiral, Baltalu, was stationed. The Ottoman cannons opened fire. The river erupted in waterspouts. Boats filled with peasants vanished in clouds of splinters, but they kept coming. As they closed, the battle devolved into something medieval. The Hungarians and Serbs threw grappling hooks. They lashed their small boats to the hulls of the great Ottoman galleys. The Ottoman soldiers high on their decks rained down arrows and javelins. The crusaders, screaming "Jesus, Jesus," tried to climb the hulls. They were slaughtered in the water. But this was the distraction. Hunyadi's core force, his professional sheikhish crews and mercenaries, slammed into the Ottoman command ships. They chained their boats together, creating a floating, stable platform. They boarded. This was not a battle of cannons anymore. It was a battle of axes, sabers, and knives, fought on swaying, blood-slicked decks. The Janissary marines were deadly, but the Serbs and Hungarians were fighting for their homes. They were fighting on their river. Hunyadi himself, 69 years old, was in the thick of it. He was seen on the deck of his flagship, a saber in his hand, his white hair stained with blood. The battle raged for 5 hours. The Danube, it was said, ran red. The turning point came when the Hungarians managed to isolate and capture 3 of the largest Ottoman galleys. They cut the chains linking the fleet. Suddenly, the impenetrable barrier was broken. The Ottoman line, no longer a single entity, began to fragment. The lighter Hungarian boats swarmed the heavier, less maneuverable Ottoman ships. Panic set in. The Ottoman admiral, seeing his line collapse, gave the signal to retreat. It was a stunning, impossible victory. The Ottoman fleet was smashed. Hunyadi, his men, and thousands of Capistrano's crusaders surged across the river and poured into the ruined lower town of Belgrade through the very breaches the cannons had made. From the walls, Szilágyi's starving, exhausted garrison roared in delirious joy. They were no longer alone. Their savior had come. A messenger was dispatched to Hunyadi. "My lord, you have come. God has sent you." Hunyadi, covered in grime and blood, stepped onto the ruined docks and looked at the pulverized walls. He reportedly said to the messenger, "God has brought me. But now the real work begins. We have not come to a feast, we have come to a funeral." The fortress was reinforced, but it was also more crowded. 40,000 or more defenders were now crammed into a half-ruined city. Morale was high, but the situation was still desperate. On his hill, Mehmed the Conqueror was incandescent with rage. His fleet, his invincible fleet, had been broken by a flotilla of river rats. He had been outmaneuvered. He had been humiliated. He summoned his generals. There would be no more waiting. The final assault would begin now. He ordered his cannons, all of them, to cease firing on the outer walls. They were already gone. He ordered them to concentrate their fire on the inner walls, the last defenses separating the lower town from the upper town, where Hunyadi had his citadel and headquarters. For another 6 days the bombardment resumed, more focused and more terrible than before. The city became a slaughterhouse. The defenders huddled behind earthen mounds and timber barricades, which were blown apart as soon as they were built. Inside the walls, a new conflict was brewing, a conflict of command. There were now 3 commanders in Belgrade: Szilágyi, the garrison commander; Hunyadi, the strategic general; and Capistrano, the spiritual leader. Hunyadi's strategy was one of professional defense. He ordered his men to hold the upper town at all costs. They would let the Ottomans take the ruined lower town and then trap them in the narrow, rubble-choked streets. It was a calculated, defensive, costly plan. Capistrano was furious. He saw this as cowardice. He saw the ruined lower town, where the Janissaries would soon swarm, as holy ground. He wanted to counterattack. He wanted to charge out and meet the devil on the field. Hunyadi forbade it. He placed his professional mercenaries at the gates, with orders to stop anyone, even the crusaders, from leaving the fortress. He could not risk a disorganized, suicidal charge. The tension between the old warrior and the old priest was at a breaking point. On July 20th, the bombardment stopped. A terrible, ringing silence fell over the city. Every defender knew what this meant. The assault was coming. That night, Mehmed held his final council of war. He would hurl his entire army at the city in one single, overwhelming wave. The irregular Azabs would go first, to tire the defenders and clog the breaches with their bodies. Then the elite, the Anatolian and Rumelian corps. And finally, when the defenders were at their breaking point, the Janissaries. He promised them the city. 3 days of plunder, every man, woman, and child, everything. As dusk fell on July 21st, 1456, the attack began. Then the wave struck. The Azabs, the irregulars, surged forward into the breaches of the lower town. Szilágyi's men met them. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, lit only by torches and the flash of steel. The Azabs died in their thousands, but they kept coming, climbing over the bodies of their own. For hours, this meat grinder of a battle raged in the darkness. The defenders were exhausted, their arms numb from swinging their swords. Mehmed, watching from his tent, saw the Hungarian line begin to sag. He gave the signal. The drums beat a new, rapid rhythm, and the Janissaries advanced. They did not run. They marched. A silent, disciplined, terrifying wave of white and steel. They hit the breach, and the Hungarian line shattered. The Azabs and Janissaries poured into the lower town, sweeping aside the last of Szilágyi's men, who fled back toward the inner wall and the bridge to the upper town. The Ottomans were in. They rampaged through the lower town, killing everything that moved. They raised the Sultan's banners on the ruined ramparts. From the river, the remnants of the Ottoman fleet, seeing the banners, began to cheer. Victory was theirs. A Janissary Aga, named Hassan, led a contingent of his finest men straight for the bridge to the upper town. This was the key. If they took that bridge, the citadel was lost. Hassan and his men reached the inner wall. They began to scale it. The battle for Belgrade, for Hungary, for Europe, was hanging by a thread. In the upper town, John Hunyadi watched. This was the moment he had planned for. He had let the wolf into the sheep pen. Now he would light the pen on fire. He gave the order. His men, who had been waiting for this, did not throw spears or shoot arrows. They rolled hundreds of bundles, wrapped in cloth and soaked in pitch and sulfur, over the walls and onto the heads of the janissaries crowded in the narrow streets below. Then they threw the torches. The lower town exploded in a sea of fire. The pitch-soaked bundles, the wooden houses, the timber barricades, everything erupted. A solid wall of flame, hundreds of feet high, sealed the upper town from the lower. The janissaries who had flooded into the lower town were now trapped. The scene, as described by eyewitnesses, was an image from Dante's Inferno. The elite of Mehmed's army were caught in a firestorm. Their woolen uniforms caught fire. They burned alive in their armor. Those who were not burned were choked by the acrid smoke. They panicked, they broke. They tried to flee back through the breaches they had entered, only to be met by Hunyadi's mercenaries, who now held the breaches and cut them down as they tried to escape. On the walls of the upper town, the other hero of the night was at work, John of Capistrano. As the battle raged, he saw the Hungarian and peasant defenders begin to waver. He saw them look at the sea of Ottoman troops and fall back. The 70-year-old friar, holding his great crucifix in one hand and a banner in the other, ran to the very edge of the rampart, a perfect target. He stood there, silhouetted against the flames, and screamed at his followers, "The Lord who made the beginning will take care of the end. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." His courage was infectious. The terrified peasants, seeing their holy man, took it as a sign from God. They rallied. They charged back to the walls, hurling stones, logs, anything they could find, onto the burning, screaming mass of Ottomans below. The greatest assault of the greatest army on earth had failed. It was a massacre. The janissaries, the pride of the Sultan, the iron wall of the empire, were broken. They fled, trampling each other, back to their camp. On his hill, Mehmed the Conqueror lost control. He saw his elite troops, his sons, running. He drew his scimitar and rode into the fleeing mob, screaming. He cut down his own officers. He tried to physically, single-handedly turn the tide. He was a madman, blind with rage. A Hungarian defender on the wall, seeing the richly dressed Sultan, loosed an arrow. It struck Mehmed in the thigh. He slumped over his horse, wounded, not just in body, but in his very soul. His bodyguard dragged him from the field, still screaming. The rout was total. Dawn, July 22nd, 1456. The sun rose on a scene of unimaginable horror. The lower town of Belgrade was a smoking, charnel house. Thousands of Ottoman bodies lay in the ruins, burned and broken. The stench of death was overwhelming. In the Christian camp, the defenders were not victorious. They were simply alive. They were exhausted, wounded, and numb. In the Ottoman camp, there was chaos. The Sultan was wounded and in a black, suicidal fury. The army was leaderless and completely demoralized. They had thrown everything they had at the city, and the city had thrown it back. John Hunyadi was a professional. He knew the battle was won, but the war was not. The Ottoman army, though beaten, was still vast. He gave his most explicit order: no one is to leave the fortress. Hold the walls, repair the breaches. We are victorious, but we are not strong enough to fight them in the open. Do not pursue. But Hunyadi had forgotten about John of Capistrano. The old friar was not a professional. He was a man possessed by God. He looked out from the walls and saw the demoralized Ottoman army. He did not see soldiers. He saw demons, routed and broken. He did not see the captured Ottoman cannons, sitting silent in their emplacements. He saw instruments of the devil, ripe for the taking. He began to preach. His voice, hoarse from the night's screaming, regained its fire. God has delivered them into our hands. Shall we let the devil's army escape? Shall we let them live to defile another city? In the name of Jesus, follow me. Hunyadi's mercenaries, loyal to their commander, barred the gates. It didn't matter. Capistrano's peasants, his crusaders, simply ignored them. They grabbed their scythes and flails. They swarmed over the ruined walls and broken breaches, a disorganized mob of thousands, and began to run full pelt across the open ground toward the Ottoman camp. John Hunyadi, standing on the rampart of his citadel, watched in pure, cold horror. The fool, he must have thought. He has doomed them all. It was a suicide charge. No formation, no armor, no cavalry support. They were running straight at the Ottoman cannons and the waiting Sipahi cavalry, who, though demoralized, would cut them to ribbons. Mehmed, roused from his tent, saw it too. He reportedly scoffed. "Let the dogs come, kill them all." The Sipahis mounted. The remaining Janissaries formed a line, the cannons loaded. This was the end of the crusade. Hunyadi had a choice. It was the choice of his life. He could follow his own orders, stay in the fortress, save his professional army, and watch the peasant mob be annihilated. It was the smart military decision. Or he could gamble. He could risk everything, his life, his army, his city, on one insane, impossible, open-field charge. The old lion looked at the peasants streaming across the field, holding their crosses high. He looked at his own knights, his heavy cavalry, mounted and ready, waiting for his command. He was a general, but he was also a Hungarian, and he was a warrior. He did not choose the smart decision. He chose the brave one. He raised his saber. To me, Hunyadi, the gates of the upper town burst open, and the Hungarian heavy cavalry, the last unbroken reserve of Christendom, charged. The Ottomans were completely, totally, and utterly unprepared. They were focused on the mob of peasants to their front. They never even dreamed that Hunyadi's tiny force of professional cavalry would be insane enough to charge them in the open. Hunyadi's knights, a wedge of iron and steel, did not hit the Ottoman line head-on. They hit it in the flank. The effect was devastating. The Sipahi cavalry, caught off guard, were shattered. The Janissaries, already broken from the night before, saw the Turk beater himself, the man they thought was a ghost, charging into their midst. The entire Ottoman army, in one single collective moment, lost its nerve. It wasn't a battle, it was a rout. As Hunyadi's cavalry tore the army's flank to pieces, Capistrano's peasants, screaming and unstoppable, swarmed the Ottoman cannon batteries. The artillerymen, who had no infantry support, were clubbed and hacked to death with flails and scythes. The crusaders, in a moment of symbolic victory, turned the Sultan's own guns around. The Ottoman camp collapsed. Tents were torn down. Men threw aside their armor and ran. The panic was so complete that the massive treasury of the army was abandoned. Mehmed the Conqueror, wounded, defeated, and utterly humiliated, was forced onto a horse and carried away by his bodyguards, fleeing for his life. By mid-afternoon, it was over. The Ottoman army, the greatest military machine on earth, had ceased to exist. It was a terrified rabble, streaming south, hunted for miles by the victorious Hungarians. The field was silent, save for the weeping and the prayers of the victors. They had done it. The old general, the fanatic friar, and the peasant mob. They had saved Belgrade. The news of the victory spread through Europe like wildfire. When the Pope, Calixtus III, heard, he wept with joy and declared it the most fortunate event of my life. The noon bell, once a call for desperate prayer, now became a bell of joyous celebration, a memorial to the victory that had saved Christendom. The spoils were immense. The entire Ottoman siege train, over 300 cannons, all their supplies, their treasury, and their sacred banners were captured. Hunyadi had not just defeated Mehmed, he had humiliated him. The Sultan would never again be seen as invincible. But the price of victory was yet to be paid. The field of battle was covered with tens of thousands of unburied bodies, Ottoman and Christian. In the stifling heat of the August sun, the inevitable consequence arrived. Plague, the The victory fever, likely typhus or dysentery, spread through the victorious, overcrowded, and unsanitary city like a ghost. The old lion, John Hunyadi, the Turk beater, who had survived a lifetime of battles, who had charged into the teeth of the Ottoman army and emerged without a scratch, was struck down by the disease. He died in his cot on August 11, 1456, less than 3 weeks after his greatest victory. His last words were reportedly to his son, "Defend the faith and your country." His friend and rival, the fiery John of Capistrano, followed him soon after. The old friar, who had seemed immune to blades and arrows, could not fight the sickness. He died on October 23rd. The two heroes of Belgrade, the warrior and the saint, did not live to see the winter. But their sacrifice had bought Europe precious, vital time. Mehmed the Conqueror would not return to Hungary. His momentum was broken. His gaze turned elsewhere. Belgrade, the key to Hungary, would remain in Christian hands for another 65 years, a defiant bastion against the Ottoman tide. The 1456 Siege of Belgrade is more than just a battle. It is a story of how the most unlikely of alliances can unite to achieve the impossible.